one thing that I actually got a lot of entertainment out of when reading this is picturing all of the male characters with huge 70s sideburns. Did you think about that at all?
I actually did, but now I will. Now I totally will. I love that.
Lillian, are you feeling spooky today?
I am feeling spooky, and it's sort of stormy here, so we might get some thunder, which is very good for today's episode.
Oh my gosh.
How are you feeling, Piper? Spooky?
I am spooky and excited. I also, same weather, and it's the one time when I'm like, ooh, it'd be nice to have some background noise. But I think the reason we are so spooky and excited on today's episode is because we are actually being joined by a very special guest. She is a horror and speculative fiction author. It's Gwendolyn Kiste. Gwendolyn has published 6 novels and enough short fiction to fill a tomb. She's a Bram Stoker award-winning author, and today we are honored to have her on the show as we discuss her newest novel, Reluctant Immortals. So, Gwendolyn, welcome to Eyre Buds.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Yay! We're glad to have you.
Yeah, we've both been really excited about this kind of as we've been reading the book. We've been checking and be like, this is like really good.
Oh, yay.
Really excited about
That
this.
makes me so happy to hear. Yay. I'm so happy to be here. Like, I feel like we scheduled this a while ago, and I've been looking forward to it ever since.
We've alluded to a book that you wrote, and Piper, I believe, said the name, but do you want to tell our listeners just like a little bit about the book for those who maybe haven't had the opportunity to even hear about it?
Absolutely. So my latest novel is Reluctant Immortals, and it is the story of Lucy Westenra from Dracula and Bertha and Mason from Jane Eyre, and they are immortals living in 1967 California and still dealing with the men from their past, Dracula and Edward Rochester, and it's set during the Summer of Love, so there's hippies and horror hijinks and just like a lot of groovy gothic fun.
Groovy gothic fun should be maybe one of the boilerplate quotes there for the book. I think that was one thing that stood out to both of us right off the bat is because obviously on our show we talk about Jane Eyre, which is typically this kind of gothic classic literature. But even though Jane Eyre gets a little spooky, like your book had some great horror elements to it, which I'm a fan of. And I know Lillian got a little ooked by.
Oh, really?
I'm like the easiest person on earth to spook. I'm so easy to spook. I spook myself all the time. So I messaged Piper at one point. I was like, I may need you to read this first and then tell me what happens. Because it's very good. I genuinely really, really loved it. And the story within that, I don't think people who are less easily spooked than me probably won't have a problem with how spooky it is. But especially those first few chapters, like even before it gets like really into some of the other stuff, I just sort of felt like creeped out.
Oh, good.
Which is very well done.
Yeah.
It's like very, very well done. But I just had to read it during the day.
I love that. Oh my gosh, I love that. That's great.
We always like to start with our guests because we're an Jane Eyre podcast. We talk about different adaptions of Jane Eyre. Obviously you know the story of Jane Eyre. What was sort of your experience with that, and what sort of got you into, what was your first time you heard of it? What do you think of it now? That sort of stuff.
Yeah, so the first time I actually saw it first, it was like a Saturday afternoon, and it was me and my dad, and we're just like flipping through channels, and it's like halfway over. My dad's like, oh, this is Jane Eyre, and it was the Orson Welles Joan Fontaine version. And like, he like knew it right away and like got me up to speed as to, okay, here's what's happening, and like told me all about everything like up to the point that we were at. And it was great because I feel like at the point we were like right in the midpoint, it starts getting really creepy. All the gothic stuff starts coming out at that point. We were only like maybe like, it was probably more than halfway over, but I was just so fascinated by this movie. I knew who Orson Welles was, and I was like, I didn't know he was in like this weird gothic like romance movie. And so I remember seeing like the character of Bertha, like, you know, kind of in the background. She's only like a shadow in that version, and being like, what is this? And like, I never really stopped thinking about it after that. I was only about 10, 12 maybe at the time. And I'm like, what is this book? Like, what is this movie that it, you know? And so that was my first introduction. And then I read the book later, and I've seen a number of the adaptations, not all of them. And I love following you guys because then you guys find ones that I'm like, I didn't even know that one existed. So it's like now there's like, I've got homework. I've got to see more versions of it. But, you know, I love it. And it's funny because in Reluctant Immortals, Edward Rochester is definitely villainous. He's definitely an antagonist. But I always laugh because it's like, I feel now, because when I was younger, I thought it was just very romantic. And as I've gotten older, I'm like, he's not the nicest guy. But there's still a part of me, even now, I'm like, there's a half of me, it's like, I still think it's romantic. And the other half of me is like, this is horrible. He's not a nice guy. So I kind of like went at writing this book in that way of like, you can have these two feelings that are completely opposite. And it's interesting, especially when you grow up with something like Jane Eyre, that it's like, you know, it's a romance. And then as you get older, I'm like, that's not a romance I want to have, though. No.
Yeah. The more she feels 19, the more that I'm like, that's a problem. She's 19 years old while this is happening anyway. But yeah, that's a feeling that I think both Piper and I and our audience can relate to, of like, I like it, but do I?
Yes.
Well, see, I think that's what is so compelling about the story. And we will talk about our unfamiliarity with Dracula as much later on. But from reading this and from watching so many versions and from talking to so many people who are so like stuck in like, what is this story? I think that's the biggest draw, is it's that moral question, right? Of like, does romance, how does it, you know, compare to your moral compass and all these other wonderful things?
Yeah.
I do just want to note for our listeners, because we got so excited, we jumped right in. But we are going to be talking a lot about Gwendolyn's book today. We're going to start with a non-spoiler conversation around it. So some of her inspiration, some of the things that you could get like from the back of the book and those pieces of information. And then at some point, we will let you know. We're anticipating around halfway through, but we'll make a big announcement if you don't want spoilers, so that you can stop, go read this incredible book, and then come back and hear about all of those spoiler conversations. And for those of our listeners who are really interested in reading this book, you don't have to wait too long. This is coming out on Monday, the 22nd, and the book comes out Tuesday, the 23rd. So you can go ahead and order it, or call your bookstore, your local bookstore, and tell them, hey, do you have this book? Because I want to come buy it tomorrow. And there's lots of opportunities to do that. We'll make sure to put out there on all of our social where you can buy the book.
Absolutely. And we'll have later on links in the episode description as well. But getting into the book itself, and like Lillian mentioned, we want to kind of start by kind of asking you about your inspiration for this. So you saw that, and Jane Eyre stayed in your head. I mean, how did the rest of this come together to say, I want to write Reluctant Immortals?
So when I was even younger, I actually, first heard of Dracula. So I feel like I first heard of Dracula at like 5 or 6 years old, maybe even younger, because I think Dracula as a character sort of looms over pop culture. Even if you haven't read the book or haven't even seen an adaptation, you're kind of aware that Dracula is a character. Dracula is a thing. And so I was a fan of Lucy for a very long time, because I was always like, oh, it's not fair. Lucy dies in the book. That's not fair. Poor Lucy. So even when I was like 6, 7 years old, I'm like, oh, and I would always think about Lucy and be like, that's not fair. And over the years then I would think about Bertha, and I'm like, what happened to her in Jane Eyre isn't fair either. And so this would keep coming up in like my mind. And then I wrote a couple of short stories, one about Lucy, and then one about, like, it's called The Woman Out of the Attic. That's just a general, like, it's kind of like that trope of the woman in the attic. Obviously, Bertha's the original, but a lot of things have kind of played with that over the years. That's been a very popular sort of gothic trope in books and movies since then. And so I wrote a story about that as well. And then I thought, it'd be so interesting. These characters have so many parallels between them. They both die, and then you have like the characters of Mina and Dracula and Jane Eyre that like are the ones that live. And I kept thinking, it would be interesting to see these two characters together. And I was like, why don't I write that? That's a story I would want to read. And I always say, write the story you want to read. And I felt like with the 1960s, it was such a tumultuous time. And so it seemed like a great opportunity to explore something like this, something very feminist, a very unusual way of looking at these two characters. And plus I like the 1960s. I've researched the 1960s since I was like a kid. So I was like, I know a lot about it already. So I feel like I can do this, So yeah, that was really where it just came from, of really just putting these two characters that I love together in a setting that I was like, that seems interesting. Like, what would happen there? Like, I want to know what would happen there, so I'm going to write that, see how that turns out.
Amazing.
That's such a fantastic inspiration. I love when you can really read that in some books. You can really see that the author was like, I think this is fun.
Yeah.
Like you can sort of see that come through in this book, just in some of the like little references you have. And specifically, the 60s in California was one of the questions that I was really wondering about as I read this, because my family happens to be from the Bay Area originally.
Yay.
I live in Minnesota now, but my dad was born in San Francisco.
Oh, cool.
His sister actually lived in Haight-Ashbury
Oh my gosh.
when she was 17 in 1969.
No way. That is the coolest thing. Oh my gosh. I'm so jealous. I love that.
Yeah, so like I like went to Haight-Ashbury and we found where her old apartment was and like all this stuff. So all the stuff that you're referencing in the book, I'm like, I've either seen that or I've heard about that, or like I know, like I called my dad at one point and I was like, the way she talks about San Francisco geography, you would love. Because he's a big nerd, so he would just get really excited about that part specifically. But I was curious about kind of, you referenced a little bit about why the time, but why San Francisco? What kind of drew you specifically to that?
Yeah, so I've always loved California. Like I haven't spent a ton of time there, but I've spent a little bit of time there. And my husband and I were actually married there. We were married in the Redwood Forest. And so like I love the state. And I think one of the things I think is interesting about California, at least when I was growing up, it's a place, obviously, but it's almost like a dream or a promise. There's a lot of idea about what is California. There's this, there's more sunshine there than, say, where I grew up in Ohio, or where I'm at now in Pennsylvania. So it's very, sunshine. There's Hollywood. There's people would go out there to achieve their dreams, whether that be for, again, with Hollywood, or I like John Steinbeck. That's like kind of random, but I think of the Jodes in The Grapes of Wrath, and it's like their whole thing is we got to get to California. It's the place we're going to be able to survive. And it's so, to me, California is such an idea. And I thought that would be such an interesting place for them to be, because they're trying to find that kind of promise. They're trying to find that kind of way through life. And, it starts in Los Angeles. And I liked that because, again, I originally was introduced to Dracula and Jane Eyre through the movies. That was, I know I'm a writer and I always feel bad, but a lot of the first introductions I've had to things are through movies. And I think a lot of people are like that because, especially like Dracula and Jane Eyre, you're probably not going to read that till you're a little bit older, middle school probably at the earliest, maybe not even until high school or college. But you might see the movie in elementary school, you might see that younger. And so I thought it would be interesting to start them in LA, in this place where we associate with the versions of Dracula and Jane Eyre that many of us first saw. And then going up to San Francisco, I was always just fascinated by the Summer of Love. I always just thought it was kind of this, between that and then Woodstock, I feel like are the two things that so many of us think about when we think about the hippie movement, when we think about, peace and love and like trying to get social change in this positive way. So because these characters are trying to find their way and trying to find like a positive way through, it just seemed like a really interesting place for them to be. Plus they're a little bit like fish out of water because they're still kind of like Victorian proper ladies. So even though this is more reflective of where they want to be, they're both like, we don't really know what to do here. This is not like who we are or where we're from. So that can be fun to have that juxtaposition between characters who are like, what is going on around me? This is really, different.
So you must have, with that love for that setting, you must have had a moment though where you thought to yourself, I've got at least 2 vampire characters and I'm sending them to the Sunshine State. How did that kind of go in your brain?
I don't even remember the exact moment that I did think about that, but I'm like, wow, yeah, like that would be like the worst place for a vampire to be, right? It's so sunshiny. Like I said, I'm originally from Ohio. I live in Pennsylvania. We have a lot of overcast days here. A lot easier, I would assume, for a vampire. But yeah, I did think how much fun that is. And then especially I realized, and this wasn't until I was like working my way through the book, that like, it's the longest day of the year on like the summer solstice, right at the time that they're actually in San Francisco. So it's like they had even less time than they normally would to have, Lucy be outside. And so, yeah, I was like, wow, that's even like another way of like, the sunshine being like an enemy to them. So that was actually fun. I actually thought like there's like built-in tension just from basically, the weather and the sun. So that's always, it's always nice when like even the weather can give you something to do with your plot.
Absolutely. And that you saying that just then makes me kind of think of there are so many moments in your story where it's about the girls are so limited about, the amount of daytime where they can travel and be out and about, but it also kind of locks them into these different like places and locations. Like I think of them being in their house and, keeping everything closed up, and they have these sort of small spaces. And then how you deal with that with Bertha's whole thing of, her claustrophobia. So it's a very interesting layering of that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Just a comment.
that was also something, because it was like when I started and I'm like, well, what would that be like if you had been locked in an attic for a long time? It's like right away I'd be like, well, I would want wide open spaces if it were me. I would not want to be in a closed in space. And so that kind of naturally built into that from there, the things that like are really haunting both Lucy and Bertha throughout the book.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Speaking of that sort of choice to lock Bertha in the attic, and obviously in your story, Rochester is very clearly a villain.
Yes.
A very well done villain who scared me a lot. but very clearly a villain. And I'm wondering, because we talk a lot about how in the different adaptions you can read, we often will joke about how in some of the versions you're like, no, I'm pretty sure Bertha is fine, and Rochester called her crazy and put her in an attic.
Yeah.
And that feels very open to interpretation within the book of Jane Eyre.
Yes.
So when you read Jane Eyre, when you see the adaptions, do you read it as Rochester as a villain? Like, is that how you see his character?
No, not always. And I think that there is absolutely the way of reading it that like he's somebody who doesn't necessarily know what to do, that he got locked into a situation. And some of the versions I feel like he's really just locked in and not obviously as much of a victim as poor Bertha, but still somewhat a victim of his time, because there weren't a lot of options back then. You couldn't get divorced, there wasn't good psychiatric treatment. If she really was mentally ill, I don't know what you would do back then. I think you could do better than he did. I'm definitely not like absolving him. Even at his absolute best, locking somebody in an attic is never, ever, ever nice. But there are times that I do think in some of the versions, there's a bit more of a tragedy in it. Like that, I still think he's definitely the antagonistic force in a lot of them, at least one of them. But I do sometimes think, depending on the version, that it is kind of just, he doesn't know what to do. And I still think he's making the wrong choice, but it's a situation where it's like, the time period was so oppressive that definitely plays into it. But then, yeah, other versions, I agree. And I think I actually think in the book, and I always forget this till I read some of the dialogue that he says about Bertha that's just vicious. And a lot of times they leave that out of the movies. I think about the Mia Wasikowska version, where I think he's actually a little more tragic in that version. Like, because he just seems really sad in it. Like he doesn't know what to do. And you end up cutting out a lot of the dialogue where he's just lambasting her and her whole family. And it's just like, whoa, dude. Like the original book, I'm like, man, that I always forget until I go back to it. I'm like, he's pretty brutal in the things that he says. He's really angry. So yeah.
Well, and how much of it is tone too, right? Like we talk about that in, I think the two extremes that we often talk about is in the 2006 BBC miniseries with Toby Stephens.
Okay.
I don't know if you've seen that one. It's got Ruth Wilson and Toby Stephens. It's a very good one, but we talk about that as peak soft boy Rochester, where he's very like little bean of a man, very, very clearly caught in that bad situation, and very clearly actually caring for Bertha in the best way that they have at the time.
Okay.
Where then the other side of that is the 97 with Syrian Hines, where he does a lot of screaming at everyone about how it's actually their fault that he locked someone in the attic.
Yes, I think I have seen that one, because he's like not romantic at all in that one. That one's just, he's really, really vicious. And it's like, whoa, like Jane, run.
Yes,
exactly.
Yeah.
So I think that's a really interesting way to kind of take that idea, that version of him, where he is just so incredibly selfish and and take that to this extreme of maybe he's just actively manipulating these people in his life, and the people who don't fit that mold get locked in an attic.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And what you said too about like the lines that Rochester says about her, that's something I think that I wanted to actually talk to you about when it came to adopting Bertha into your story, or B as she's called,
Yes.
is because most of what we know of her from Jane Eyre is told from potentially a very unreliable narrator or a
Yes.
biased narrator in the very least. So when you decided to write her as a character, how did you approach that, and how did you decide to give her a voice to a character that previously didn't really have much of one?
You know, one of the things I wanted to look at was, reading his dialogue and being like, how could this be? If you look at him as someone who's manipulative or abusive, what would I see? Like, and sadly, the people maybe I've known in my life that have been manipulators, when they said things like this, what was really going on? And kind of like doing that sort of flip side, and then like kind of building her slowly from there. And also just thinking about women who do like kind of push back against their own time period and say, I'm not going to go with these social norms. What do they look like? And kind of, again, just fleshing her out from that point and thinking, also, he talks about her, about when they first met and how everybody just thought she was so beautiful and she was the socialite. And, we don't get a lot about that, but we get enough that I'm like, if everybody wanted to be around her, she couldn't have been that bad, right? Like, people will pick up quickly. It's like, I don't want to marry that girl. And yet everybody wanted to. So I always felt like those lines about her, I actually believed from him the most in the book, no matter which version I was thinking, because it was like, that seemed like, an assessment of what was going on. And I always thought, like, in that way, it made it even make more sense to pair her with Lucy from Dracula, because in that way, they're both socialites. They were both sort of the lives of the party. Everybody liked to be around them. And then this force comes in and they're no longer allowed to be the life of the party anymore. So that was sort of where I kind of came into it and thought, they both were socialites and they both did like to be around people. And that was something that, made them happy at some point to some degree. And so that was really where I kind of came from it at, and then just built her out from there to see, who is she and what did she really want, and what would have been a better ending than obviously being locked in an attic. So
Most other endings.
Most other endings.
If I had to pick, picking an ending, I think I'm going to pick most other endings before I pick Bertha's.
Yeah.
So obviously our listeners are very familiar with Jane Eyre. Otherwise, guys, what are you doing here? We love you. Please stop. You don't have to listen to it. You're okay. Unless you just think we're so charming that you don't even care about Jane Eyre, which works. But our listeners are most likely to be pretty familiar with that. You might have guessed from my level of spook tolerance that I'm not super familiar with Dracula. So I obviously have some opinions about this question, but I'm very curious as to what your thoughts were on how familiar do people need to be with the story of Jane Eyre and the story of Dracula in order to enjoy your book.
I honestly think if you just have a kind of passing familiarity, you can probably come into it and follow it. I tried to keep that in mind. I assume most people who are going to read it are going to have some familiarity with both stories, but I tried to actually fill in the blanks a lot as I went along, so that way if you just are like, I have no idea, or if you only know one and not the other, which I know is a possibility, I tried to keep that in mind as I was writing it. Plus, also, what I did a lot was kind of rewrite them anyway. So in some ways, there's some things that are different. What goes on in the attic, for example, is very different in Reluctant Immortals than what actually happens in Jane Eyre. And some of the things with Lucy and how how she meets her end in the book, the original book, and how that is very different in the version that I created. So I think a passing familiarity, but you don't have to like reread it right beforehand. I think you'll be able to easily follow along if you're just like generally know about the two books.
Yeah, that definitely, I think the way that I felt reading it, not knowing the story of Dracula and like the name Lucy sounded familiar and that Dracula was a vampire was how much I knew. My level of understanding vampire lore is fully when I was 14 and read Twilight. So like that's where I'm at. But I very much felt like I think you did a really beautiful job of making a lot of allusions to the story, because with Jane Eyre, I could pick up on all of those. And sort of that way that you were able to talk through them seeing their own stories play out as told by others, and the way that they sort of like talk through that wasn't how it was, and like you're able to sort of retell those stories from these new perspectives, but in a way that's not like, okay, sit down, ladies and gentlemen, let's talk about everything from my life and retell the story you know already.
Yes, that was something I very much wanted to avoid. I didn't want it to be something, especially for people who were at least somewhat familiar. I didn't want them to be like, oh my gosh, are you really going to tell me the story I already know? So I wanted to kind of, that's good. I'm glad that that's not how you felt. I did it. That makes me happy, because that was something I was trying to avoid.
It's sort of like if you watch like a really great sitcom and you watch just one episode versus watching like all of the episodes. Like that's kind of how I felt, where it's like you can follow the story, you've got all the stuff that you need, you can enjoy this book, but there's little nuggets of extra special things that you can pick up if you know the story really well.
And that was exactly what I was trying to do. I thought, let's like just put in little bits and pieces here and there. So it's something that if you just go right over it, that you don't catch it, no big deal. But if you do, it can be kind of like, hey, I know we all like these stories, so here's this thing that's like a reference back to the original.
I was going to say, too, is that, so, like, I might have read Dracula when I was in middle school, maybe, but I've definitely listened to it on, like, audiobook with my dad. I saw the movie that had the guy from Harry Potter in it, and that doesn't help, but whatever. I saw one of the
Gary Oldman, right?
Yes, that's the one with
Bram
the big
Stoker.
bun head.
Yes.
I saw a bun head version of Dracula.
That's perfect.
And then there's so many other like vampire things that I have consumed that I'm a big fan of. So one thing that I think is so interesting when it comes to like writing about vampires is I feel like nowadays there is no strict set of rules.
Yes.
Like you can kind of change anything to make it work for your universe. How did you sort of approach that when kind of taking some well-known vampire laws, adding some of your own? What was your process for that?
What I think is so fun about vampires in particular is that because we have such a familiarity with them, that you can do almost anything now. And so I thought, what do I want to do in mine? What do I want to comment on? Because so many things people think came from Dracula that didn't come from Dracula. Going out in the daylight, he could go out in the daylight, it just wasn't powerful. It didn't like turn him into dust. I actually still like the lore of it turning the vampires into dust. It's fascinating, but I like the idea of trying to go back to that source material, saying, here's what isn't from that. So this wouldn't have been necessarily from the world that she was coming from. And so kind of playing with that and seeing, the different types of things you can do. And I love how Dracula always comes back from the ashes and things. He always comes back. I watched all the Hammer movies growing up, and I always loved them. But he's always coming back. There's always some weird way that Dracula comes back. And so I was thinking about that, and I'm like, and that's where, like, in it, she has, like, several urns of his ashes, and she has to keep the urns separated because, like, the urns are always trying to get together and break apart so he can rise again. And I just thought that was... Because oftentimes in the vampire movies, like somebody deliberately tries to raise him or somebody does something silly and he comes back. But I'm like, what if he's just always trying to all the time and he's just like opportunistic? So that was like how I approached that. So it just seemed really fun because I like the idea of these urns always like bothering her and like even each having their own personalities, like these like distillations of his personality. So it just seemed like a fun thing to kind of play on the vampire lore that a lot of us already know.
That's great. And I have to say, by the way, you mentioning the Hammer films, I recently became obsessed with them. I'm a big Peter Cushing fan.
Yes,
and so the fact that his name was mentioned in this book made me very happy.
What's funny about that is when I first went to write it, I was like, how much am I going to reference the original movies? How much is that going to be something that I'm going to do? And one of the things was, and I'm like, I can't imagine writing this book in a world where Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee aren't in existence. Like that actually made me sad. So I'm like, just lean into that and let's actually play with that and have it be this thing of like, okay. And yes, at the end, when she actually mentions Peter Cushing, I was so excited about that. Like, I love that you brought that up because I was like, I get to mention Peter Cushing. This is great. Because even though she's a vampire, she's also like a vampire hunter at the same time. So I just thought it was like a fun play because I love Peter Cushing in those movies. He was the
That's
best.
amazing.
So good.
So I feel like we're ready to transition into our spoiler conversation because I have a lot of super specific questions that I want to ask about things. But Piper, did you have anything else pre-spoiler before we jump into that?
Oh, I think my last kind of pre-spoiler thing, and we've sort of already talked about this, but so one thing that I'm also curious about is, so when adopting such classic and beloved characters to an original story like this one, each one, like we've kind of talked about, comes with their own well-established reputations and fan bases. Did you consider that at all? Was there any kind of pressure to think, oh, someone's going to have a lot to say about how I put these words into this character's mouth? Or were you just kind of the author who's like, no, they're my characters now? How do you feel?
I was aware that there's definitely going to be, some people are like, because this is not a purist take on this at all. So I feel like, this is definitely not one that if you're expecting, because I just wrote a nonfiction article about this, talking about how retellings, they can be very close to the original source material, or they can go way off into a very unusual direction. And I've always liked retellings that are just really bizarre and really out there, or really do something I never expect. Because otherwise, I just want a straight version, just a normal version of the original material. I just want it to be a very, I like that. That's fine. Adaptations that are very close to the material are great. But if you're going to do a retelling, in my opinion, go do something different. Do something that people haven't seen before, because otherwise they can just go back into the original source material. So I do know that some people might have issues with some of the ways that I, rewrite the characters, but I tried to keep with each one of them, I tried to look at what am I trying to say about their personalities, and trying to keep certain aspects that to me are like the big parts of who they are, and being true to them in that sense. But then from there being like, also we're all changing as human beings, right? As you get older, you're a different person, and they've got a lot of years to change. I mean, you think how much you change from being a teenager to when you're in your 20s or 30s. Imagine, when you're a teenager until you're like 200 or whatever, like you're going to change a lot. So my thought was, and especially going from the era that they're from into the 60s, you're going to have unusual reactions to things. So I just kind of went with like, how would I react in this situation? Maybe not the way I would react like yesterday when I went to the grocery store, right? Like if I'm in this situation, it's going to be different. So I kind of like tried to keep that core of who I felt that they were, and then just kind of let this, kind of unfold in what way I felt like I could see them being.
Awesome. Very cool.
Yeah.
So let's do spoilies.
All right.
Okay. So I'm going to be so explicit. If you should read this book, we're going to say that because I loved it. But if you don't want it to be spoiled, please stop listening, go buy the book, read the book, and then obviously come back. Because we're going to say cool things about it. So specifically with talking about the vampire lore thing made me want to move into the spoiler discussion, because I want to talk about all these little nuances, because I see the vampire lore. I read a lot of fantasy books. And I almost felt like it was an interpretation of a magic system, like the way that you kind of go into the sunlight is memories instead of it being some of those other pieces, the way that her thrall works, the way that they kind of like come back from the dead. So all those different pieces. How did you sort of, and I think the way you melded them in was really good, because I get very over really detailed magic systems where you sit down and go, let me student teacher explain to you all of the rules of this magic system. But it sort of came up naturally, but it felt really thought through. So how did you approach, was your approach sort of like, this is the way I want to tell this story, so I'm going to add this function in? Or did you think through the functions first and then go, here's how that would play in this space, in this scene?
I think there was some of both. I think there was some things that it was like way in advance. I knew, this is how I want this specific, vampire legend or vampire lore to work within my story. And then other things was, as it was going along, I'm like, and in the first draft, kind of finding those moments of like, okay, well, what would happen here? And then kind of building that lore into it. And so, yeah, with the memories and the sunlight was definitely something I feel like that happened in the moment on the page early on in the first few chapters, because I remember being like, I knew I didn't want the sun to turn them into, dust. Again, I don't mind that. I actually think that can work really well in some things, but I like the fact that that wasn't in Dracula. So I thought, okay, well, what would it do? Because if they're not as powerful, what would happen there? And I thought so much of this book is about memory, is about living in the past, is about the trauma of the past. And so I thought it would be interesting is that's what it brought out, especially when we think about sunlight. We always think, oh, it's pure energy. It's something very pure. And so to me, it just seemed like an interesting thing of like, oh, it's, this purifying thing, but then it brings you back to this place that feels very, very dark. And that was, to me, an interesting juxtaposition with using that. So that was why I was like, okay, I'll go in this direction. And then I felt like that to me was an interesting way of approaching it for Lucy. And it also this is kind of like showing my hand as a writer. It also helps you do a little bit of backstory and exposition without having to be like, now let's go into a flashback. It actually made it so it's part of it. So you can take this moment and you get a little bit of what she's going through and what she's been through without it being like, and now I'm going to have a dream. Not that that's the end of the world. I've seen that done well in things, but it's like if I can find like those moments that it makes sense organically to talk about, and fill in a little bit of details, that's always like what I like, because I'm not a person who like, oh, I want a whole chapter on the backstory of something. My husband doesn't mind that. It's always interesting. He doesn't mind that at all, but I'm like, I don't like that. Some people don't mind it.
Yeah. My brother is obsessed. Like the magic system thing that I was talking about, my brother is always recommending books for me. And some of the books that he recommends, it genuinely is like 3/4 of the book is the logistics of the magic system. And I will call him and I'll be like, I hate you. Why would you do this to me? So I totally agree. It can work well. It can be done well. And some people really enjoy it. Not for me. And I think the way that you did that and utilizing some of these mechanisms was great. Specifically the trauma, I think is talked about really well, and how that works with memory. I know this is going to be weird that I'm going to quote your book to you, but my favorite line that you did talking about that was when you said the past is always heavier than you expect it to be. That was a moment of like, as I've had some traumatic experiences, and there's definitely like that experience of having those traumas triggered in a space when you're like not ready for it feels like that, the way you described the sunlight bringing out those memories. And it's one of those things where like, it is a vampire experiencing a magic thing, but it's also this incredibly human experience, which I think is balanced really, really well in this book.
Good. I'm glad to hear that, because that's definitely how I feel about it, and I feel like a lot of us sadly can say that when you have this moment that something reminds you of something from the past, that you're like, whoa, I was not braced for that at all. I was not ready for that. And how like very jarring and scary that can be. It can be very, very uncomfortable at best. So yeah, that was definitely what I was thinking of. So I'm glad. Not that I'm glad that you feel that way. I obviously don't want you to feel that way, but I'm glad that at least, expressed that.
One thing too, that I'd be very curious to get your personal thoughts on is, so I think when Rochester's in the book, he's pretty much just a bad guy and Bea wants nothing to do with him, and neither does any woman really, if they're not like being hypnotized by him and his wealth or whatever. But I feel, and maybe this is my own kind of weird, kind of dark gothic fangirl who loves romance whenever I can find it, I feel like there's a different kind of level of connection between Lucy and Dracula. Obviously, it's a very toxic, bad relationship. He's a bad guy. She doesn't want to be with him. But was there an element when writing their scenes together where there is sort of like a bit of this like kind of forbidden romance element, or no? Am I just a crazy person?
No, I definitely think so. Yeah, I very much think so. Because for me, again, going back to trauma, right? And I think that a lot of us have been in relationships with somebody that we're trying to get out of that relationship because we know it's bad for us, that it's toxic for whatever reason. I mean, there's lots of different ways a relationship can be toxic. And obviously theirs is particularly toxic over decades. But yes, I very much felt it was like this situation where it's like both of them, even he knows he shouldn't be, still hanging around her, but he can't help himself. There's like this, I mean, obviously he could help himself, right, if he wanted to, but it's like, it's this type of thing that it's almost like this irresistible thing between them, and it's so toxic, and they both know it's toxic. But some of their scenes are some of my favorite to write because there's so much tension there. It's like I'm like yelling at Lucy, get away from him. And I'm yelling at Dracula, like, why are you still hanging out with her? She wants to kill you. She has killed you. She will kill you again the moment she can. Like, both of you are better off getting away from each other as quickly as possible. But Yeah, I thought it was actually really fun. I actually liked writing their scenes. I mean, there are a lot of scenes in this that I actually really enjoyed writing. This is probably the most fun I've ever had writing a book. But with them, every time, like, they take a couple car rides together, and it's like get out of her car because it's her car. I'm like, Dracula, get out of her car. That is Lucy's car. She loves that car. Get out of her car. But it was fun to write those scenes because there was so much built-in tension. And again, even if you don't know a lot about Dracula, he's always going after women. In all the versions, he's always going after women. So you at least bring that to the table usually, as I would assume as a reader. And so it's like, yeah, terrible toxic relationship, but definitely still an attraction between them. Run, Lucy, run.
I love that you mentioned too that she is dangerous to him as well, because I think that's a part of the draw of vampire fiction in a lot of senses, is that it's scary and it's sexy. And I think the fact that we find it sexy makes it even scarier, because it's that whole taboo thing.
Yeah.
The biting itself is very kinky. It's intimate. There's this weird level of control to it that, like, you shouldn't want, but you kind of do. And so that level of equal danger that, like, he will always try and, like, I don't know, manipulate, control, but also kill her. But then she's also trying to kill him right back. And that's so interesting. Just had to say that.
That actually is one of the things that I was really, really curious about. And I think maybe this is something that was really well done and very, very interesting in this book in particular. But it's the way that kind of the desire sexually, but also like for food is so intertwined in these characters. And like, particularly with the character of Michael and the way that Lucy has this thrall over him. So there's no potential for consent there.
Yes.
And she's very, very aware of that. And it's the thing that she hates the most about Dracula.
Yes.
And so there's constantly this desire for him, and she has that, and Dracula has that desire for her. And there's this like weirdness there, and the way that desire and control plays in together, I found really, really interesting, and I'm curious about what your kind of approach to that was.
Yeah, with the character of Michael, that was actually one I felt like I had to be very careful about, because it was like I didn't want her to go so far that like the reader's like, whoa, no. Even though we come into it, we know she's a vampire. We know she doesn't want to be a vampire, and I feel like there are like these, unlikely vampires that you see throughout media, the characters that don't want to be vampires and have to figure out ways to kind of subvert it. So I felt like, you bring that into it, and people do know that this is a kind of character, a kind of archetype of the kind of, unlikely vampire, reluctant vampire. And so I'm like, okay, so we have that. So that, people can bring that to the table. But it was something that throughout the entire book, I'm like, I want to show that, yes, she is dangerous, and that, yes, that this is something she's always fighting, but I never wanted it to go so far that it's like, no, this is not a character you can like anymore, because she pushes that, that issue of consent was something with all of their scenes. I'm always like, okay, we're spoiling it, right? So I can say that was why it was so important at the end that he leaves. He takes off, because there's no way after what happened between them that they could ever have a happy ending. It was really important that it was like, they may have, in a different set of scenarios, be able to be together, but in this scenario, no, what she's done has crossed too many lines. And so it was like that last scene in the last chapter was really important to me to show, like, he leaves, he still likes her, she still likes him, they still care about each other, but there's no way after everything that's happened, because the consent is, he has not consented to any of this. And so that was definitely something that I was thinking about throughout, because I didn't want to push it so far that people were like, no, I don't like Lucy because of that. I'm like, I want to make sure you don't like Lucy for another reason, that's fine. But that was the one reason. I'm like, I'm hoping nobody dislikes her for that, because I tried to be very careful with that, even though obviously at one point she does bite him, because I did want it to still be, she's still a danger. If you don't show that there's danger, then there's no danger, right? Like, so it was important to me of like, especially Dracula, Renfield in that case, I think she had come back from being killed by Renfield, and so she's so hungry and she's just delirious. But at the same time, like, you can't go and bite Michael. You can't do that, Lucy. That's not okay. And so, but even then she leaves them. And then, of course, there's the cascading effect of when she's away, that's when Rochester and Dracula get them. So there's like the whole... Every decision they make, even when they're trying to make the best decision, keeps having these effects, this kind of domino effect throughout the book.
Well, and I think it's such a good example, the whole moments with her and Michael. It's such a great way to flip that gender stereotype on its head. So you're seeing that differently, and the way that you feel about that, I think we all have that ingrained sexism that lives within us that some of us fight really hard against all the time, but seeing that gender kind of flipped on its head, you can see the difference in the way that story is. And it really highlights the way she reacts in instances where she could take power and control with this non-consensual power that she has. And every time her saying no, except for in that situation where we see kind of why she says no to that, because he would have just let her kill him. But I think that's such an interesting way that plays out with that character.
Yeah, I was going to say, I thought the parallel of our two kind of like primary thrall characters of Michael and then also Renfield is kind of this, like, here's an example of what might happen to Michael if this goes on too long. So I thought that was a nice parallel balance. And also, well done to take a character that I typically think of as being like, gross, get that bug-eating guy out of here. But I was like, no, I think he seems like, I love how he's trying really hard to help her because he knows that he and, I'm blanking, he and Lucy are both, puppets on Dracula's strings. And so he's like, us puppets got to work together. And the few times when he can kind of like defy his master, it was all very gratifying. And to see him get peace in the end too was nice.
I know, poor Renfield. I've always loved Renfield. I think when I was really little, he kind of scared me. But as I've gotten older, I'm like, oh, he's really tragic too. Like, he doesn't want this. Like, this isn't what he wants to do. So I thought it'd be really fun because so much of this book was about taking these characters more on the fringes and kind of giving them a little bit more of a spotlight. So I like the idea of kind of bringing him in and having him be. He's in it probably almost as much as Dracula is because he kind of shows up throughout, unless you count the urns, which honestly, that's Dracula. So Dracula's in a lot more, but Dracula as standing there in front of you, like mouthing off. Because man, Dracula, he's always mouthing off to Lucy.
Oh my God. Both of these men, you did a really good job of making them realistic and unbelievably annoying. Like just the most and because it felt so real, right? Like you're like, these are immortal like guys who treat the world like they're gods and the world is there to serve them. But there's a lot of references that Lucy makes to the idea that this is kind of how men treat the world. And I think that was probably even more true in the 60s, although it still holds true today, of just women are for taking and men are doing the taking. And I think that is, I felt like a very clear message in this book is that is not that's not what's real, but that is what the kind of trope is and what the world usually kind of demands of those genders.
Yes, unfortunately.
I was just going to say, not to go from a very serious, important topic to one that's quite silly, but one thing that I actually got a lot of entertainment out of when reading this is picturing all of the male characters with huge 70s sideburns. Did you think about that at all?
I actually did, but now I will. Now I totally will. I love that. No, I didn't think of that, but that's great.
That's perfect.
Honestly, I pictured when Renfield showed up that he would have big 70s sideburns. Even though he's a decaying corpse, I think he was still trying to style himself, so he had like the big glasses as well. At least I hope so.
I love that so much. That is great.
That's perfect. Another piece that is both lighter and although heavier than Piper's large mutton chop reference is this is like the reason that I was like, we have to do a spoiler section because I need to know what she thinks about this. I sort of lost my mind with the Jane and Bertha were in love the whole time. I love that idea. Because I was honestly, I love a romance. I'm mainly a romance reader. And I was like, listen, I'm going to read this book and it's going to be scary, but it's going to be good. And it's going to be a good book to read. And then Jane shows up and they're in love. And I'm like, someone to root for. So I'm wondering, like, how did you think about that? Was that something you thought about really early on? Oh, yeah. Did it just sort of happen organically as you were writing it? What was the process there?
The original short story I wrote was the woman out of the attic was absolutely that was built into that story. That was basically the crux of the story, was that this was, these type of characters that are kind of repeating these different versions and different variations of this gothic story. And they're the two that actually fall in love. In that story, the kind of Bertha character is already a ghost. And so it's like, it's this ghost and like kind of like the Jane character. And so with this, it was a lot more fun in a way, because they're actually both still like corporeal. They're not like, one of them isn't a ghost, even though they're both undead. But yeah, so that was something really early on, because I always like to be, even when I was young, I was always like, we need to get rid of the guys. The girls should just run off together. Even when I was little. And so the girls just need to run away together. And so that's like always my solution as a kid. Just run away from the men, just run off together. And so it was like, this was like my opportunity to be like, just run away together. Although they did, obviously Jane doesn't early on, and then kind of lives to regret that. But they get to be together at the end. I can say that because we're doing a spoiler section, which is fun, because like that way I can say, because that was like something that was absolute throughout, that I knew they'd end up together. That was so important to me, to be like, they go through all this, but they get to be together. Yes, they lost a lot of time, but they're immortal. So they're, although at the end, they're not really necessarily immortal anymore, but they'll get to live out the rest of their life together.
Love the idea of them growing old together, though, right? Like that they've had this tortured existence that both of them have had so long of like not really getting to live their lives, and then they truly get to live their lives at the end. I loved it. But I think that was probably my favorite part, because I love a romance. But so just there's so many, it also felt such a great representation of the two different ways these women who are abused by the same man experience the trauma of that. Because I think my interpretation of the way the character of Bertha acted was she just wouldn't bow down to what he wanted. So he locked her away. And then Jane made compromise after compromise until that strong character that we know by the end of the story of Jane Eyre, we know her as this strong character. And then the idea is after decades that gets chipped away until she's just a person who does what he wants.
Yes, that is exactly how I approached it as well. Because to me, it's obviously, that's probably the character that's the most different, I think, from the original. Because it's like, and I feel at the end, she's definitely back to being, feeling like a more whole person at the end of Reluctant Immortals. But very much so. And I like that, to say that it's compromise after compromise. And she kept trying to find ways to be able to make this work, like so many people do in abusive relationships. That's a thing that very much happens. Like, okay, I'll compromise on this, because we're all told you should compromise sometimes. And in many cases, that's really good advice. But in these cases where it's compromise after compromise, and by the point that we see her, she's just very worn down from like decades of this. So that's very much where we came in with Jane. That it is a different Jane Eyre, I think, more so than any of the other characters. But I feel like, she finds herself as the story goes along, and is able to reclaim who she is.
Very nice.
Yeah, and I think Lucy does a great job of kind of being the person pointing that out, because she's not, it's interesting to watch that relationship from solely Lucy's perspective, because she sort of starts from this perspective of, we can't trust Jane, and then she evolves into this, okay, well, she has betrayed us, but I guess I guess I get it, because I've also been in this abused place.
Yes.
But for B, it's harder because she was the one who trusted her originally, and that trust was broken.
Yes.
So I thought that was really well done and really interesting to see kind of their sympathies flip, even though Lucy refused to tell B how she should feel.
Yeah, and like you said, with B's character in it, like, she's all the way along, just like I think a lot in the original Jane Eyre. She never goes along with what Edward Rochester wants. It's always from the kind of the get-go in the original, and in this version, it's like, no, I'm not doing what you say. I'm just not, like, that's not how it's going to be. Whereas Jane, again, in the original and in this, is much more amenable to trying to work with him on things. And so it's like, when Jane turns out to, betray them midway through the book, B is just stunned by it, and it's like, how could you do this? I would never do this. And then at that moment, like you said, is when Lucy's like, well, I kind of know what this is like. She and I are a little more similar than I wanted to think. And so I feel like that particular thing, even though I kind of knew the general, I very much knew where everything was going, but that specific sympathy between Lucy and Jane, I feel like did develop as I was writing it, because I realized very, very much on the page, I'm like, this is very much what Lucy's going through, and she's going to recognize that, and she's going to be like, I don't want to admit that I know what this is like, but I do know what this is like. So yeah, that was definitely something that it was interesting to explore, and it wasn't something that right away I knew was going to happen until like I'm in that moment of writing it and being like, that's really the direction that I feel like this would go, because that's what, if I was in that situation, it's kind of like that's where I would be like, oh, I actually know what that's like. I wish I didn't know what that's like, but I know what that's like.
So Gwendolyn, when someone picks up Reluctant Immortals, what is your hope of what they will get out of the story and take away from this tale?
Honestly, the main thing is just celebrating the characters of Lucy and Bertha, and just having that, focus on them for a change, because I feel like these are two stories that we know of. We know Dracula and Jane Eyre, and to me, just giving them a chance to shine, giving readers a chance to get to know them and see something from their point of view is really just the main thing I want people to take away from it. And hopefully just, a fun, what I say, groovy gothic adventure. It's like a horror adventure story, just fun foray into the 1960s.
Awesome. Very cool. Do you have any other kind of like gothic books, movies that you would recommend for people if they love this? Like, what else should they check out?
Wow, that's a great question. Like we said, I've already been talking about the Hammer movies. I'm sure most people who like Dracula have seen them, but if you haven't, definitely check out the Hammer movies. And, even if you have, watch them again because they're fun. One movie I think about, even though it's not vampire, is the movie The Love Witch. It's very much got it's got a very kind of 60s feel to it. It looks almost Technicolor, even though it isn't. And so that kind of color palette and kind of women trying to navigate a world. And it's based in California, so it's actually set in California. So I feel like that's one that if you guys haven't seen, it's a little bit gothic. And it's not super gothic, but I think it's a little bit. I think it counts.
Very cool. Awesome.
That's great.
I'll put that on my list for sure.
Well, and then obviously all of our listeners should go check out all of your books, because I know Piper and I have already talked about, I'm going to let her read them first and tell me if they're too spooky for me. But Piper already mentioned that she saw some of yours that look particularly good. And if they want to see those, they can find that on your website. So your last name is spelled Kiste for our listeners. So you can find Gwendolyn. All of her website has all of her books and the short stories that were referenced and all of that good stuff. So if you have read this book and you're now obsessed, you can go binge all of her stuff and find it there. She's also on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram under that same name. So you can find all of her social, and we will be tagging her in all of our stuff as well. And we'll put her website in the episode description. Yeah. But do you have any other projects that you're working on? Any other appearances that you have? I know you've got a lot going on this week with your book coming out. Anything else that our listeners should show up for?
I don't know. Probably. But I'll probably have it on my website. I'll have it on my website and on social media, because I'm sure there'll be something that I will be promoting by this point. But yeah.
Yeah. So for our listeners, we are recording this in July. So we are recording it a month early. So it's understandable that you don't know your schedule for a week, a month from now off the top of your head. But yeah, you can find all of those socials, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And we'll make sure to tag you on all of those so our listeners can find you really easily.
Yeah. But Gwendolyn, thank you so much for joining us and for giving us a look into your creative process, your inspirations, and just the ability to chat with you about all things spooky and girl power and groovy.
I love it.
Spooky and girl power.
Yes, spooky and girl power and groovy. I love that. That's awesome. Yes, thank you so much for having me. This was so much fun.
Yes, thank you so much. As always, our listeners, you can find all the Airbud stuff at Airbuds on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And then you can email us, airbuds@gmail.com.
Absolutely. We'd love to hear from you. And Lillian, do we know what next week's episode topic is, or is that a mystery?
The next episode is going to be on the actually very first TV movie, which was in 1949. I have heard not great things. So our listeners recommended this. It's one that we can watch in multiple chunks on YouTube. It looks like it might be one of our little bit campy, little bit less the spook, more the wow, you did put it on film though.
Oh,
So
boy.
we'll find out.
I love
Haven't
those,
actually
though.
watched it.
Those, like, I either want like the best of the best or the worst of the worst.
Absolutely. I agree.
So much content to discuss.
Oh my god. So that'll be next week. Piper and I do really ham it up for those. So please join us again to talk about the 1949 TV movie.
Mm-hmm. But until then, thank you everyone for joining us, and happy Jane Eyre reading and watching, and go check out Reluctant Immortals, because it's definitely worth your time. It's a wonderful book. But thanks. That's all for now. Bye.
Bye.